Well, welcome again for the second day. Third day. Second full day. And just how are you doing? Is there anything that you want to bring in before Habeeb starts with his presentation? Anything like is the room okay? Is anything else that you think is maybe important to share? Okay, well, I will create more opportunities. So if you think of something, then later on I will check in with you. Well, then I think we're ready to roll.
So, Jaap and I were just discussing that this is, I know some people yesterday were frustrated at ending the conversation, ending the discussion, but this is a similar topic building on what Connie talked about yesterday, so I think it's going to be fruitful for what we were talking about yesterday, and any ideas that you might have wanted to say yesterday and weren't able to are going to fit into today's framework too. So I'm looking at war and terrorism and identity and group conflict. And the framework that that was laid out for us for looking at the role of external and internal. Where is the primary cause of these crises that we're facing? Is really a very appropriate way to look at this question of violence and war and terror and conflict, because clearly the outer is apparent to all of us. You can pick up the newspaper, you can see what's happening in the world, and you can read about conflicts, you can read about terror. Just this morning, a breaking news story was that ISIS is apparently developing chemical weapons. So you can read the outer, and I think the question is, what does the outer tell us about the inner? What's happening, what humans are doing as groups. And as groups, I mean nations, nation states, religions, terrorist groups, ideological movements, whatever. This group behavior that so often becomes conflictual and violent, what does that tell us about the inner? And then similarly, what does the inner tell us about why we behave the way we do? So again, the outer is what we see these groups doing, that under certain conditions and when effectively mobilized, groups, meaning nation states, religions, sects, terrorist groups, whatever, will be the sources of tremendous violence, perpetrating war, terrorism, genocide, apartheid, which is violence, oppression, which is violence. Doesn't have to be, I think you said violence when you were looking at your surveys was people being killed, but there's other violence. Oppression, apartheid was violence, oppression is violence. So all of these things are being done in the names of groups, and that's the extra, that's the outside manifestation. But the inner, looking at the inner, is that search that we were talking about yesterday with Connie's talk, that apparent human need to identify with a group, that apparent human need to be part of something bigger, to not just see yourself as an isolated self, and at the same time, not to see yourself as part of just global humanity, but to find groups, whether it be religions, nations, ethnic groups, race, ideology, political groupings, anything that we align with. So I want to start with the question of why do we need group identities? Why do these form? What do they do for us? Why can't we just each be, this individual, or see ourselves as part of a collective whole, or see ourselves as part of a oneness with all humanity? Why do we need to see ourselves to identify with particular groups, particular group affiliations? And I think There are a number of answers to this question. There's a number of speculation. But I think one point that I want to make first is a point from evolutionary biology, and that I'm quoting here the psychoanalyst Erik Erikson from his book Identity, Youth, and Crisis. He said, "Man's need for a psychosocial identity is anchored in nothing less than his sociogenetic evolution. Identity can be said to be a good thing in human evolution because good things are those that seem to have been necessary for what indeed has survived." So I think we have to start with considering that possibility, that while we're focusing here in this, my talk is focusing on the problems that group identities cause, that there's also a social evolutionary need for it. We tend to do things that are good for us as a species to survive, right? So this need to identify with groups must be serving some evolutionary, sociogenetic evolutionary function, or we wouldn't keep doing it. That doesn't mean, though, that it doesn't lead to and cause problems, and maybe that could be one of the questions that we'll explore later. Can you have an identity? Can you feel good about you're a member of an ethnic group, or you're being part of a certain nation, or you're following a certain religion path? Can you do that without it then resulting in conflict and violence? Because I think it'd be a very hard task if our goal was to figure out a way for people to stop identifying with anything, because it just seems to be too innate, too primal. And I'm going to talk in a minute about a very fascinating case study which reveals that. But to go back to this question of why do we need group identities? Why do we feel the need to identify? I think Krishnamurthy would say it's conditioning. We're all told from very early in life, you are this. You are my son or daughter. If you're brought up in a religious family, you're immediately brought up in that religious faith. You may have an ethnic identity that is part of your conditioning that you're brought on. Society tells us things too. Society labels us. It's not just how we label ourselves or how our families label us, but it's how other people label us too. An example of that, how society tends to label people. Barack Obama is described as our first African American president, our first black president, but his mother was white, right? So he's equally white as he is black, but society has decided he's our first black president. So we are ascribed, our society tells us who we are. And that kind of conditioning is very hard to overcome. Our families have religious traditions, obviously language traditions, geographical continuity. Your family was from, your grandparents were from Italy and lived in Italy for centuries. We're told all of these things about who we are and what groups we are part of from a very early age. So I think that conditioning is very much a part of it, as well as the sociogenetic need for it. But it's not just conditioning. It's not just conditioning. Conditioning, I think, is maybe how it gets perpetuated, how it continues, how it lives on and on. But I think, again, in line with what Erikson said about psychosocial identity being anchored in sociogenetic evolution and fulfilling needs, I like to look at this pyramid. Where is it? I'm sure many of you know this, Abraham Maslow's famous hierarchy of needs. People know this. Abraham Maslow was a psychologist, very big in the 60s and 70s. And he said that there's basically a hierarchy of needs. Sorry, I didn't do a PowerPoint because this is the only thing that I would have had up there. Nothing else. So I have this visual. So it didn't seem worth the trouble. But basically at the needs, right? Food, shelter, water, just survival. What up? You have safety needs, and then belongingness and love needs, esteem needs. So these he kind of breaks down as the four most basic starting obviously with just physiological needs for survival. Then the need to know and understand. So the need to kind of understand the world, the need to have some kind of philosophy about what it's all about. Above that, aesthetic needs, music, arts, pleasure, visual pleasures, whatever, things that meet some need for aesthetic enjoyment. And then above that, self-actualization and transcendence. This need to feel that we transcend this life, or that we transcend this body, or that there is more to our existence than just the years that we're blessed with on earth. And if you look at these basic needs, you will see that different identities fill these basic needs. Your identity with your family fills the physiological needs. Your closest family members, your closest friends, being part of a tribe or a clan or a family, extended family. Moving up, safety needs, that's filled by your membership in a community. Again, also in some levels by clan or family. Belongingness and love needs, esteem needs. Esteem may be felt by, I was reminded of that when I think of esteem needs of this wonderful George Carlin routine, comedian George Carlin back in the 60s. He talked about how he would go to the St. Patrick's Day parade in New York, and people were wearing buttons that said "Proud to be Irish." And Carlin, who was of Irish descent, would laugh about that and said, "Proud to be Irish? What did you do? You didn't do anything. You just happened to be born in a family that come from Ireland." So there's a pride, there's an esteem that you get from being members of a group. Maybe it's from having a group accept you, so you feel proud about that because you got into a certain club or a certain prestigious college or whatever. But esteem needs are met with group identities. And then the need to know and understand, that could be anything from identifying with a religion to identifying with an ideology to identifying with a guru or whatever, but this need to have some kind of framework for life, that often is met by identities. And then obviously self-actualization and transcendence are very much tied to religious identities, what people look for by maybe joining a particular religion. So I would argue that this hierarchy of needs that Maslow developed explains a lot about why we feel the need to identify. And what's important, and this is where I'm linking this to fear, these needs, the thought of not having these needs met creates fear, especially the needs down at the bottom, physiological, the fear of not having food, the fear of not belonging, the fear of not being safe. So you have these very primal needs. Maybe there are people that don't fear not having transcendence or a sense of transcendence, but the further you go down this pyramid, the more the lack of that need being met creates fear. So what you have is fear, I think, as in many ways the greatest source of our need for group identity, because the group identities give us something, and the fear of not having that is met by being in a group or by identifying with the group. And you can see in situations, just to kind of quickly relate this to a current world situation, how when you have a nation state, which the political scientist Benedict Anderson said all nations, though I think you could actually apply this to all major groups, are imaginary communities. Because they're not real communities, right? I mean, I'm an American, but how many other Americans do I know? I don't know all 300 million Americans. But by saying I'm an American, you're kind of suggesting that I'm part of this community of 300 million, but for the most part, it's imaginary. I don't really know all these people. My community is my family and my friends and the people closest to me. So all large group identities we have are really kind of imaginary, but they give us this sense of security. So if you take a case like Syria, where you had 10 years ago, if you were to stop people in Syria and say, what are you? most would have said Syrian. So they had this sense of identification, and that being Syrian provided all of these needs, gave them all the needs they met. They were citizens of the Syrian nation, Syrian state. Once that fell apart through the uprising against the Assad regime and then the civil war that ensued, you had people ratcheting back to more and more basic identities because the needs were no longer being met by being Syrian. So if you wanted to be safe in the civil war, you align more with your community, Sunni or Shia or Christian or whatever your community was in Syria. And the more and more it falls apart, the more it gets down to just your basic community, your family, your clan, your immediate group. So these identities are fluid, they change. So that today, if you were to stop someone in Syria and say, what are you? Who are you? Then he might say, I'm Sunni, or I'm Christian, or I'm a resident of Aleppo, or the identities become much more narrow. But that fluidity and that movement is because of needs being met. To say I'm Syrian today doesn't meet any need. Being Syrian doesn't protect you, it doesn't give you anything today. So that's an example of how what we identify with can change, and why also why at different times of life, different identities might be more important to us, might be more salient, because we have people who become, religious or seek spiritual answers later in life. Suddenly they have a need to think about transcendence, or a need to think about self-actualization or whatever. So they may find themselves attracted to a religion or to a guru or some other identity or group that meets that need. Now let's kind of analyze identities a little deeper. I do an exercise in my class, and I do it in the first class before we start talking about identities. And I ask them to just write down, without really thinking, without reflecting greatly, just to write down a list of all the identities they have, everything they feel like. I am a whatever. And then I aggregate them. And what is amazing is the degree to which, even though I tell them don't consciously rank them, just write them as they come to you, almost invariably the first 3 or 4 that they put are what the vertical identities. These are the identities that we are permanent. We cannot change them. This religion, nationality, ethnicity, those things that are permanent. So they have a verticality to them. And I say conditioned to believe, in fact, all identities are social constructs. But race, for example. Race is a social construct. I mean, skin color simply has to do with the amount of melatonin in your skin. I mean, it has nothing to do with anything else. It's a social construct. But we're all conditioned to think that's permanent. A black person couldn't become a white person couldn't become a black person. We tend to see religions that way. We tend to see where we're from, the nation state, or the geographical area. So those invariably are listed first by these students. And then it gets down further, it gets down to, things like lover of jazz. Well, that's what's called a horizontal identity, because those are changeable. You can add those, and you could start becoming a jazz lover at age 50. It's not considered this kind of vertical, permanent, who I am at my core identity. And what's interesting, the other interesting thing when I do this, first let me just point out that it's the vertical identities that people fight over, right? Wars are between nations, wars are between ethnic groups, wars are between religions. You're unlikely to have a violent conflict between jazz lovers and country music lovers, right? They're just not going to do, it's not that important, right? So it's those vertical identities that people tend to first blurt out when asked what your identity is. Those are also the ones that we tend to fight over. Another interesting thing that comes out from this experiment is that identities that are under threat, that are somehow perceived as being under threat, are often ranked high or often ranked when other identities aren't. For example, over all the years that I've been teaching this course, very frequently does someone have as one of their identities, and it's usually one of the top 4 or 5, woman. I think maybe only once or twice have I had somebody say man, because most men don't think of maleness as part of their identity, because they don't feel they have to fight for that. They don't feel that they have been oppressed because they're men. So that immediately tells us that we sometimes identify with the group if we feel that we are part of that group and that group is under threat. Gay. I've had a lot of students who will put gay as one of their identities. I don't think I've ever had a person put straight as an identity, because there's no reason to. Obviously, African American students will put African American or black. But if I were teaching this course in an African country, if I were teaching it in Nigeria, I bet nobody would put black as identity, right? Because they're not separated out. That gives us another kind of hint that the things that we feel are threatened can be a mobilizing for mobilization for rigidly holding on to identity. And after they do this, and they get in, I ask them a question because I want conflict. The question I asked them to do, or I asked them to think about, is identities. You know, some identities, because they start putting brother, sister, child, son or daughter, or whatever. You know, group identities, and I specifically for, because unfortunately people kill for road rage, right? People kill for all kinds of reasoning to die for, because involving something bigger than yourself, or willing, being cafe or something, that was something you were willing to die for. Well, if you sign up for the U.S. Army so you can go fight in Afghanistan, you're willing to die for what? I don't really know. I don't identify with that. And clearly, there have been times, like in Vietnam, when a lot of young people said, wait a minute, I don't want to die for this. I don't want to die for this cause or this. There have been other times, Connie, you were talking this morning about people landing at the beach at D-Day, where either there was groupthink involved and they were all landing and just doing limbing what they felt they were supposed to do, but I think there were people who really felt this is worth dying for. But if you word it that way, then I think a lot of my students found that even though those top 4 or 5 identities, they weren't willing to die for. So even Georgetown's a Catholic university, so a lot of the students would have, ranked fairly high Catholic. But when you're asked, are you willing to die for Catholicism? Are you willing to die for that? Then the identity kind of loosens a little bit. But clearly there are people willing to die for group identities. And that's why we have conflict. It's not because people are willing to die. And their leaders eventually die. Identity. I flipped there and said, for your religion. These upper made group identity die for it, right? So think about the way nations will, national cemeteries, national holidays where you celebrate the war dead. That's all turning kind of nationhood into a religion, a quasi-religion almost. I used to go to the Soviet Union in the 1980s when it was still the Soviet Union, and this is, of course, was an atheist state. I mean, official policy with atheism. But, oh man, you go to the military cemeteries from World War II, and they were religious shrines. I don't care what anybody says. They were religious shrines. The way they were presented, the way student groups would come and get on their knees and put flowers down. I mean, this was a religious rite. So that's all kind of part and parcel of getting people to die for the group, making them think that if they die, they're dying for something greater, something transcendent, something that will live beyond them. So that segues into the question of why do group identities so often resort to violence against other groups? And that's the violence that I'm talking about here, not crime. And as I said, I'm defining violence a little more broadly to include apartheid, oppression, all of those things. Anything that is done oppressively against another group. And the question, I think, to look at, based on all the things that we've talked about over the last day and a half, is group violence innate? In other words, I think group identity is innate. I think that is just part of our socio-genetic evolution, as Erik Erikson said. But is group violence innate? In other words, is it part of the inner human condition? Is it part of the inner human condition to affiliate in groups and then to perpetuate violence against other groups? Or is it the result of conditioning? Is it learned behavior? Is it something that we have learned to do as groups? So could perhaps be awakened out of. And there have been some efforts on the outside world. On the outside, there have been efforts to do that. United Nations, peacekeeping movements. There have been all kinds of things that have been set up and organized to do that, but they're addressing more the outside. They're not really addressing our thinking. They're not addressing the inside of how people think about what their group identity means. There are two interesting arguments for the innateness of group violence. And let me talk about these two, because these are two really, I think they're, one was an experiment by a social psychologist. The other is a theory by actually he was a student of religion. There was a social psychologist by the name of Muzafer Sharif. He was a Turkish American. He taught at the University of Oklahoma. And in the 1950s, he did an experiment, which you could never do today because a band of lawyers would prevent you from doing it. But it was called the Robbers Cave experiment. And what he did is he took 24 boys who were 12 and 13 years old. And they were almost completely homogenous. They were all from white suburbs of Oklahoma City, because Oklahoma City was a segregated city at that point. This is 1954. They were all from white middle-class suburbs of Oklahoma City. They were all Protestant Christian. They were all white. They did not know each other beforehand. And he took them to this summer camp. He invited them to expenses paid by the University of Oklahoma, a 2-week or 3-week summer camp at a park called the Robbers Cave Park. Hence the name Robbers Cave Experiment. But what he did, he took them separately in groups of 12. And he took one group first, and they had their campsite and their little dorm and their, recreational activities over here. And then he took another group, and over a hill, he set up their little site with their dorms and their place. And in the middle was the cafeteria, the dining hall, where they all ate. And then there was a baseball diamond they were supposed to share, and a lake and a couple of other things. So he put them over there, and then he just sat back and he watched what happened. So neither group knew that the other group was there. So the first thing that happened is within each group there was, and this is part of what he talks about, there was kind of a hierarchy developed. So whenever you have 12-year-old boys in a room, a hierarchy is going to develop. There's going to be a leader, there's going to be the weaker ones at the bottom, there's going to be the followers, so all these different roles. And that happened in both groups. And then he arranged, this is why you can never do this today, because it's like using people's children as lab rats. The counselors, the camp counselors, arranged for the groups to spot each other. So like They went on hikes where they spotted each other. And I'm not going to go into all the details. It's a fascinating book. It's still in print. It's called The Robbers Cave Experiment. But essentially what happened is as soon as each group saw the other group, they treated the other group as hostile, as a threat. And the first thing that happened is, and this was about 4 or 5 days into this, the first thing that happened is each group came up with a name for itself. So this group said, we're the rattlers, like rattlesnakes. The other group became the eagles. So until then, they hadn't called themselves anything. They were just 12 kids in a room, in camp, playing and having fun. Now, we're the rattlers and we're the eagles. The camp counselors kept messing with them, having them encounter each other, and they started just spontaneously yelling things to each other. And, the camp counselors organized once they had like a fight over the dining hall, because for the first 4 or 5 days they were eating at totally separate times, so they didn't know that the other group was there. But now they had them, one group leaving just as the other group arrived. And so they were creating all this friction. But it was friction over nothing. It was friction over nothing. It was just groupness. And it got to the point that there were rock fights, which the counselors had to stop. Again, this would be an attorney's field day today if somebody tried to do this. The counselors tried to organize safe competitive activities like a softball game between the two groups, but it was very nasty and very vicious and a lot of name calling and stuff. And both of the groups both of the groups spontaneously claimed that God was on their side, that God is for us. So at the end of the day, and he eventually figured out a way to reconcile them, but I'm not really going to talk about that. Because what this shows is the tremendous power. These are 12-year-olds. And I know 12-year-olds can be very conditioned, but still, these are 12-year-olds. They were already thinking group. They saw the other, and they immediately made the other an enemy, immediately made the other a threat. They struggled, because they were all the same, they were all white boys from Oklahoma City, they struggled to come up with manufactured identities, the rattlers and eagles, and they each had flags, and they each created narratives about themselves that rattlers are brave and eagles are cowards and this kind of thing. They just created this structure. And of course, what I saw when I read this was you see humanity. You see all of humanity. That's what we do. And even when it's total homogeneity, that's still what we do. There's still our group and their group. The other thing I wanted to mention is a theory by a guy named Andrew Bard Schmuckler. It's called Parable of the Tribes. It was written in 1982. He has a theory of how group violence began through social evolution. And his argument is basically in the earliest times when people lived in, clans or small family groups or whatever, he said, let's say you had 5, each one of those chairs is a clan that lives in, proximity to each other. They can live peacefully with one another, but if one, for whatever reason, becomes aggressive, perhaps say its water supply diminishes or something, so it needs to attack that clan to get water. If one becomes aggressive, then over time, everyone learns to be wary of the other. All it takes is one. You could be living peacefully together, but if one is aggressive, then you start this chain where you have to assume that the other, what we don't know, what is not part of us, is potentially aggressive. So over time, because it's social evolution, over time, the groups that remain peaceful just die out because the aggressive ones take them. So you're left with groups that were wary, that were suspect of other groups. And then over time, of course, these clans have become countries and nations and other large entities. So my own feeling on this that I would put out as my own hypothesis is that the search for groupness, for belonging is, I know you don't like this phrase, but hardwired. It's, it is innate, and it's innate because it fills needs. I mean, don't fool ourselves. It fills needs, right? I mean, there are a lot of people that say, I've had some students actually who have said, I don't really regard myself as an American. I regard myself as a global citizen. And I've said, well, what would you do if you were in XYZ country and a civil war broke out and you had an American passport? Would you run to the American embassy? Yeah, you probably would run to the embassy. Suddenly I'm an American because they're flying helicopters out. I think I'll be an American right now. So, because it meets a need. At that point, that identity would meet a need. And if you could get out of that country by going to the American embassy and saying, hey, get me out of here, then you're suddenly going to feel that identity. So, the search for groupness and belonging is hardwired, which of course doesn't mean it can't be changed by reflection and meditation and the awakening of intelligence, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's really anything that's inner can be reflected on. So that, and groupness and group identity is one of those things. It's something we can certainly think about. But once group identities become dominant, and I'm talking here mainly, again, about the vertical identities, right? I'm not talking about if you're a member of a stamp collecting club or something, that's part of your identity. I'm talking about these hard vertical identities. I think certain processes begin to happen. And the first is an us-them process, us versus them. You cannot have an us unless you have a them, right? So when these 12-year-old boys got out in the camp, they didn't think of themselves as the eagles until they saw this other group. So suddenly we are now an us. We're now the eagle. We have to have a name and a flag and all that. We're now us, they're them. So you cannot have an us without a them, which means group identities create boundaries, right? There are people who are in and there are people who are out. So Krishnamurthy would call that separateness. But they're separative by nature because everybody can't be in your group. Then it's no longer a group. Then it's the world. So our group is us, everybody else is them. And inevitably, I think it's inevitable, maybe it's not, but, and again, I'm speaking here generally, I don't mean every single person feels this way about any identity they belong to, but inevitably we see us as better than them, right? Because why would you be us if you're not? Why would you say, well, this is our group and we're not really that good, we're kind of pathetic? No, you're always going to be better, right? That's what it's about. That's the self-esteem need, right? That meets by being part of this group. And of course the problem you get there is that seeing that you're better than others leads to superiority. And in its worst, it leads to supremacy and genocide. We're not only better than them, but they're not even really human. I mean, they're really, they're not just outside our boundary, they're outside the boundary of humanity. And especially, I think it also encourages groups to feel threatened by other groups. We're better than them, so they're jealous of us. So they want what we have. Or they want to kill us, or they want to destroy us, or they want to take what is ours. So seeing us as better than them leads to superiority, which can lead to actual supremacy. And think about this. I mean, in its worst manifestations, this becomes Nazism, colonialism, racism, apartheid. This is all saying us is better than them, right? I mean, that's the bottom line. A particularly dangerous combination is religious identity and nationalism. And periodically in history, these have combined. So here you have two very strong vertical identities that are combined together. Also, ethnic identity and nationalism can be a very dangerous, the ethnic purity. I mean, that was the Nazism, right? It was German ethnicity, which, remember, all of these things are socially constructed. There's no such thing as Everybody came out of the Great Rift Valley in East Africa, right? So it's not really the later phenotypes that developed in languages and groups that settled in different parts accounts for outward differences or differences in appearance or differences in language or whatever. But fundamentally, there's no ethnicity. I mean, there's no, the Germans as pure Aryans. I mean, Germans are this mix and hodgepodge of people over the centuries that crossed through Central and Eastern Europe. But the myth of ethnic identity also becomes tied to nationalism. And kind of this is what you were talking about. I think fundamentally what a lot of the people that, like Donald Trump, is appealing to essentially are trying to say to be American means to be white. That there's an ethnicness to being American, which of course is contrary to what America is and always has been. But that's what they're trying to say. This is a white Christian country. So they're trying to link race, ethnicity, religion with American nationalism. So we don't want those Mexicans coming across the border, not only because they're taking our jobs, which they're really not. In fact, last year the flow was the other way. More Mexicans went back to Mexico than came into the U.S. But I think more importantly, Samuel Huntington, who was a prominent political scientist at Harvard, and then he went kind of bananas later in life, but he wrote this book, article for Foreign Affairs magazine, which I'm sure was only published because he was at one point a prominent political scientist. It was called The Hispanic Challenge. And his argument was that Hispanic immigration is going to change America because they don't have the Protestant work ethic, because they don't share Northern European values. But he was basically ethnicizing America. So I think that's an unspoken part of this anti-immigrant. It's not just building the wall because they're coming to take our jobs, but because they're not white Protestant. So this whole thing is really trying to tie ethnic identity and religious identity to American identity. So it is really a very dangerous thing because when that's done, you often get violence because these are very strong vertical identities and you tie them all together and it becomes very dangerous. So just to kind of summarize what we said so far, fear leads us to identify with groups. Fear of not having these needs met. Fear and the desire to have needs met. It's a combination. Maybe fear that the need's not going to be met is what can lead groups to violence, but it's fear and need that drives us to identify with groups who we believe will protect us from losing those needs. Groups need others, those outside the boundaries of the group. So every us needs a them. And the others at best are inferior and at worst are a threat. So the result is conflict, war, terrorism, a group conflict, group war, and terrorism. I want to comment here on a couple of assumptions about identity that I think, if the goal is to get out of this cycle, clearly there's an outer way to address that through structures, international structures, nations coming together, mediation, conflict resolution. And there's some positive things to report there. There's been a lot of progress in that area, which is probably one of the reasons that violence is down, as you noted, or as you quoted Steven Pinker. I think there are other reasons that deaths from violence are down, and that's the fine-tuning of war, so that you're sending drones and things like this. You're not sending 500,000 soldiers. War's becoming very technical. But that doesn't mean it's fueled any less by hatred and prejudice and everything else. It just may mean that there's fewer, people being killed. So the assumptions about, so there are things being done in the outer world. I don't know how much is being done inner. And of course the problem with inner is that it has to be done by individuals, almost on a one-to-one basis. You can't do it on a massive scale. Now, that being said, there is a role in here for individual leadership. And I like to always compare two leaders in particular in how they mobilized the idea of identity. One was Slobodan Milosevic, who, when Yugoslavia was a unified nation under Tito, when Tito died, it held on for a while as one nation, but as tensions began to grow, Milosevic consciously and purposefully and directedly stoked Serbian nationalism through fear. The Kosovars are Muslims. They want to take from us. There's a wonderful documentary, a BBC documentary on this called The Fall of Yugoslavia, and it has some fabulous archival tape where you can see the speeches Milosevic is getting about, we Serbians are under attack, they want to destroy us Serbians. So that's one idea of example of a leader who mobilized identity by playing on fear. The other pole would be Nelson Mandela, who did the exact opposite, who mobilized people behind the idea that there can be a new South Africa in which whites and blacks, South Africans live together. So some of that interchanging can maybe be done by leaders, if the leaders have done that interchanging, I guess. And if the leaders are respected and charismatic and have legitimacy and all of that. But it's fundamentally up to people to do that interchange, to think about what it is we're identified with. What are these identities I hold? What assumptions do I hold to that identities? What do I ascribe to that identity? What do I ascribe to other people? When I see someone else on the street or I meet someone who says they're from such and such a country or whatever, what is my conditioning? Am I immediately ascribing things to that person that I have no basis, I have no factual basis for believing is true? But I've done it because I've ascribed it to that group. Like I was saying yesterday with women, if you're interviewing a woman for a job and you've labeled her as a woman, what are you ascribing things to that? Do you immediately put descriptors that you have no factual basis of knowing whether it's true? But some of the assumptions that I think need to be addressed. One is that vertical identities are primordial, real, and unchanging. As I said, my students tend to list, when they list the things they identify with, they list these vertical identities first: religion, ethnic, national group, race, sexual orientation. Those things that we have this idea are fixed and unchanging. In fact, they are social constructs. So reflecting on that alone could have a tremendous change in the way we think about things, especially since it's those vertical identities that are most likely to lead to conflict and violence. Another assumption is that national identities are based on an ethnic lineage that is somehow pure. This is also an assumption that really doesn't hold water. In the United States, we kind of accept that because that's except for these people who are in resistance now who want the United States to be a white Protestant country. But in much of the world, nation states are built around the myth that this is basically a large tribe. The French people are an ethnic group and an ethnic identity. This is of course nonsense. I mean, there's been so much fluidity and movement of people around the world over the years. The history of the world is basically one of migration and movement of peoples. So that's another assumption that I think is worth challenging. Third, that race denotes something real. As I said, it really relates to melatonin in one's skin. And different phenotypes have developed because more geographical circumstances or where a particular group of people settled on the world or whatever, the effect of that. But it's not real. There's no reality to it. The fourth, that national or religious or ethnic narratives are true. Most group identities are based on a narrative, some narrative. This is who we are. All religions are based on a narrative, right? I mean, that's what religions are. They're a narrative based on their texts and their religious books. And some of those have contributed greatly to the world in terms of aesthetic needs. You know, great artwork, great religious artwork, or great religious poetry, or religious stories. Where it becomes dangerous is when these national, religious, or ethnic narratives are held as truth as opposed to being held as narratives. Narratives are not facts. Narratives are not history. Narratives are stories. And these stories are designed to promote group cohesiveness and maybe to answer some of these needs, need to know and understand, right? So in that sense, there was no difference between the New Testament and Das Kapital. Both were designed to help to tell people this is how the world works, and both developed large followings based on that because they both address the need to know and understand. But they are narratives. And then, of course, the other thing that, as I mentioned earlier, that needs to be questioned is the many assumed stereotypes that are made about groups, both by group members, those things we ascribe to our group, which can be dangerous because, as I said, they're often ways in which we're better than other groups. That's usually what we ascribe to whatever group we're in. It's ways that we're better. But as well as things that you ascribe to other groups, which are usually negative in nature. There's a couple of other things I wanted to talk about, and then I just want to give some examples of how Krishnamurthy addressed this, because he certainly did. That was one of his core messages, was about nationalism and identity with religions and other things. So he was onto this, I think, very early. But one thing I want to talk about, and I think it's important to talk about when we talk about violence of any type, group or individual violence, Catherine, this gets into the question of gender and whether gender differences are something real or whether this is all imaginary or socially constructed. Most wars throughout history, most violence, organized violence throughout history, and probably unorganized violence throughout history is committed by men. I mean, I think that's just a fact. I don't think we need to speculate on that. I think if you were looking at the Earth on a time-lapse photo, a time-lapse video over the last 10,000 years, and you couldn't see national boundaries and you couldn't see borders and anything, all you saw was men were blue dots and women were red dots. So that's all you could see, is just the men and the women. And you watch this time-lapse video the last 10,000 years, you'd probably conclude by saying, boy, those blue dots fight a lot. In fact, that's mostly what they do. So I think the question of the reality of that, because I don't think it's a question, I think it's a reality that wars have been mostly fought by men, group violence is mostly by men, ISIS's recruits are about 70% male, the 30% that are women who willingly join. I mean, there's some women who've been kidnapped, but the 30% of women who willingly join are almost never put in combat roles. They're either there to marry an ISIS leader or to, do some domestic type things. But this is primarily, group killing is primarily a male activity. Now, if you think there's no difference in male and female, that if you think that's a social construct, then I think it's really important in order to address violence and conflict of every type to figure out why men are being raised to be warriors. Why are men being trained? Is it totally a social construct? Or there's a guy named Joe Herbert who is a biochemist at Cambridge. A neurobiochemistry or something, one of those fields that's where they have various different titles merged together, who has just written a book called Testosterone. And he claims that it is not only social conditioning, that there is actually a chemical basis for aggressiveness in males. So I think, when we talk about whether there are differences or whether all differences are imaginary and socially constructed, when we talk about violence, I think we have to look at this question of why does one of the two identified genders, or the main two identified genders, because I know there's small numbers of people that don't identify with either gender, but why is what we call males, if you don't agree, if you don't want to see it as a separate group, why are those people that we call males responsible for most of the violence in the world? I mean, I think that's something that definitely needs to be explored. Is that an outer thing, meaning it's part of the physical makeup, it's just biological, or is it something inner? Or could it be outer but still controlled by inner reflection and thinking? All males don't kill. All males aren't violent. All males aren't rapists. One of the kind of provocative points that Herbert makes in his book on testosterone, it's a very provocative point, but he's actually trying to be optimistic, and then he's saying we can reflect and think and control these things. He said what is really amazing is not that there is rape, but that there isn't more rape. In other words, if we were just driven by aggressive sexual drives, there would be much more rape and sexual aggression. So already there's control, already there's reflection and control and social structures and value systems. So when I say that something is innate, that doesn't mean it can't be changed, right? That doesn't mean it can't be reflected on. Just a couple of the things, and these are just going to be a couple of quotes as to how Krishnamurthy recognized this issue. Probably most of you know these comments or similar ones, and this goes back to 1946, or right after World War II. As long as we divide ourselves into groups, nationals, different religions and ideologies, there will be the aggressor and the defender. The causes of war are created by you and me. War is the spectacular expression of our daily existence. We identify ourselves with a particular group, national, religious, or racial, because it gives us a sense of power, and power inevitably brings about catastrophe. You and I are responsible for war, not Hitler, Stalin, or some other super leader. So that sense of power, that's not one of Maslow's needs, but I think it's inherent kind of in all of them. It gives us a sense of being the member of something that's bigger than us, and therefore we are part of this powerful thing. What is a sane man to do who is opposed to war? First, he must cleanse his own mind, free himself from the causes of war, such as greed. Therefore, since you are responsible for war, it's important to free yourself from the causes. That means, among other things, that you must cease to be national. Are you willing to do that? As long as there is any form of identification with the family, with the national group, with the dogma, with the belief, obviously it is separative. That's what I was saying earlier. Anytime you are a member, anytime you see yourself as a member of something that has a boundary, whatever that boundary, whether that boundary is gender or ethnic or whatever, you see a boundary there, then you're separated, then you're separating yourself from others. And as I said, my own concept is that separate inevitably leads to superior, senses of superior and supremacy. Look, I have identified myself with an ideology. he could equally have said nationalism, religion, ethnic group, or whatever. I must protect it because it is my security, and I resist anybody who threatens that in the sense of having a contradictory ideology. So where I have identified myself with an ideology, there must be resistance. I build a wall around what I have identified myself with. Where there is a wall, it must create division. Then there is conflict. So anyway, this, as you see, he linked it very much to fear, very much to fear, the need that something is threatened, the need for security. So you see, sir, wars are created by tribes. These wars are caused by ideals, religious ideals, national ideals, and ideals created by thought. So again, that's the imaginary part. These are thought, the results of thought. They're not necessarily the result of anything real and tangible. So in any event, I mean, I could go on and on because I was here 2 years ago, Yap, you recall, and I worked in the archives and found some wonderful quotations from Krishnamurthy, where he had really caught on to this very, very early at a very violent time in history. One final thing I want to talk about, and I think this is another way of thinking about this question of why we seek identities, what we're looking for there. There's a fellow just down the road here at Claremont Graduate University, Michael Hogg, is a social psychologist. He has identified why young people, especially, and especially young males, so again, this goes to the gender question, especially young males are attracted, what motivates them to identify with certain groups who exist primarily for violence. This could be gangs, inner city gangs, gangs like MS-13, which is a Salvadoran-based gang that's very big, and it's bigger in the US than it is in Salvador, but it's a gang. Or it could be ISIS, or Al-Qaeda, or any of these terrorist groups, most of which recruit predominantly males between the ages of about 14 to 25, somewhere in that point. And what Hogg has proposed is that he's come up with a term called existential uncertainty, feelings of uncertainty about one's world and one's place and identity within it. So not just uncertainty about what I want to do with my life, or but real existential uncertainty. What is my place in the world? Who am I? What am I? What am I all about? What is the world all about? That people who struggle with that are particularly prone to be attracted to groups that give them an answer. And the answer can be very simple. The purpose of your life is to fight jihad and kill heretics. It can be comforting and embracing. MS-13, come join the gang. They're women, they're drugs, we'll protect you. Now you have a purpose. But it's a particular age group that seems to be very prone to that. And as Hogg says, uncertainty motivates behavior. We often think of uncertainty as being gridlocked. Like you're not, like, I don't know whether to order this dish or that dish, right? Uncertainty is like I can't make a decision. But existential uncertainty is so uncomfortable and so painful that it motivates behavior. Cause you to do something. And if there's somebody there that's offering you an identity, something that you can be a part of, even if it involves doing violent and horrible things, you might be very prone to follow that. I think what it suggests is that the extreme amount of fear and anxiety that is caused by not feeling that you're part of something bigger, by not feeling that, by feeling well, as he terms it, existential uncertainty. And that's certainly something that's obviously an inner problem. So here, an inner problem in young people becomes an outer problem. And that's the connection, the close connection between the two. The problem is inner, but the group behaves outer and becomes then in the headlines of the newspaper, but it's all driven by this inner problem in people. Another example of that is specifically, I've done some work on the people that have been recruited into ISIS from Europe, some of whom were not born into Muslim families. Actually, about 25% of whom were European by birth. They were not, or came from Christian families. There's a French scholar called Olivier Roy who has done a lot of research on this, and they found that a lot of times when they've intercepted young Europeans on their way to Syria, they've intercepted them in Turkey usually, and captured them or found them trying to cross the border. It's very common for them to have among their the things they're carrying the French version of the book Islam for Dummies. And the point Olivier Roy makes is they're not driven by theology. They don't even know Islam. They're driven by the desire to be a part of something, to be in a group, to be a membership. So they're, on the plane to Syria trying to read this, very quickly learn about Islam, because that's what I'm going to go die for, so I want to know something about it, right? But it shows what the real motivation is. Now again, there are certainly recruits from the Islamic world to ISIS who may be driven by ideology. But for a lot of the ones in Europe, that has nothing to do with it. The other target that ISIS will often go after is second-generation Muslim immigrants to Europe. And this is, and I think this tells you a lot about how identity works. First-generation immigrants usually accept their immigrant status, so they know they're really not, let's say a Moroccan who immigrates to the Netherlands. He's happy to be there. He raises his family there. He knows he's really Moroccan. Maybe he struggles to learn Dutch, but he gets a job and he works. And he goes back every summer to Morocco to visit his ancestral village and his aging parents and everything. He has an identity. He's a Moroccan who has moved his family to the Netherlands. But his children are born in the Netherlands. They go to Dutch schools. They speak Dutch. They root for Ajax. They grow up feeling that they are Dutch until they get to a certain age, and the society surrounding them says, "You're not really Dutch. You know that. You're not really Dutch. You're dark-skinned. You're Muslim. Even if your family doesn't go to mosque, you're a Muslim. You may speak Dutch, but you're not really Dutch." So he goes home with his parents to visit grandma in the village in Morocco. And he doesn't feel at home there. That's not his home. He lives in Amsterdam. He roots for Ajax. He maybe doesn't even speak Arabic very well. A few household words. So that's not me. I'm not a Moroccan. I'm not Dutch. Who am I? What am I? I'm nothing. Existential uncertainty. What am I? What group am I a part of? And then, if that person is so inclined, and remember, we're talking about a minority of people on the planet. I mean, that's how terrorism works. It's highly leveraged. A handful of people can make headline news, but it's still a handful of people. But still, if that person is so inclined, he gets on the internet and he sees a jihadist preacher, on a website or something, and suddenly, here's my answer. That's who I am. That's my group. This is giving me meaning. This is giving me certainty. This is, I guess what I'm trying to say is this is a very real issue. It's a real issue, and we see it reflected every day, whether you're looking at a Trump rally and how identity is reflected there, or whether you're looking at a terrorist incident and how identity is reflected there. whether you're looking at the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and how identity is reflected there, and because again, that occupation is a form of violence. What is the basis of that? What is the superiority that's driving occupation or other forms of oppression? You look at Native American reservations in the United States, which are really the remnants of genocide. I mean, that's what reservations are. So they're remnants of genocide, and yet they still live under tremendous oppression and poverty and lack of real attention from the federal government. So you see this everywhere, and I think the inner task has to start with being conscious of it, being aware of it, seeing it in action. Not only when you read the newspaper, but seeing it in action in yourself. What are my assumptions about other groups? What groups do I feel I'm a member of, and why? And, you know, yeah, if I were in a country where civil war broke out, I would certainly proudly wave my American passport at the embassy. But, you know, die for America? I don't know. I don't know that I would. I mean, it's how far am I willing to go for the things I identify with? I guess that's what I'm trying to say. I don't think it's a question that we have to feel guilty if we haven't erased all our identities. I don't think that's possible. I don't think it's possible. And as Michael Hogg and the example of these second-generation Muslims shows, that could be bad. It could be dangerous. So these kids that are growing up in the barrios of LA or El Salvador who feel that they have nothing and they are nothing, they're going to look for something. And what they find may not be, I mean, maybe it'll be religion. You know, maybe they will convert and become evangelical Christians, which has its own problems. But at least they won't be running drugs and killing people. So, but they're going to find something. They're not going to just go through life floating like a leaf in the wind. They're going to latch on to something because they need these needs met. We all need these needs met. I think it's what we do with them and how we handle them. So that's it. Thank you.
Do you want to take questions now, or do you want to have a break?
Maybe a break. It's almost 11.